Welcome to the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the Global Energy Center and the Adrienne R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, welcome to Grid Resilience and Extreme Weather Events, a fabulous discussion about a lot of the issues that we're facing right now. I'm Kathy Boffman-McLeod. I'm the director of the Adrienne R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. And we're focused on bringing resilience solutions to climate change, human migration, and human security, including health, food, and water security. And we've pledged to reach 1 billion people with resilient solutions by 2030. Today's topic is about grid resilience, which is clearly linked to human health and vulnerability, and clearly linked to economic vulnerability. And we need resilience in our grid system to protect the health and livelihoods in our communities. And these solutions need to be holistic. The climate exacerbated fires, heat, and smoke of the West, and the stronger, slower, and more numerous hurricanes, and the blows they land along the Gulf Coast and eastern seaboard are stunning in their harm to people and their growing costs. This is our new normal. And a vulnerable grid just makes it worse. One example was featured in the New York Times Magazine this weekend about Lake Charles, Louisiana, after Hurricane Laura. When it hit, it left 400,000 people out of power, and more importantly, without air conditioning. And a heat wave came on top of that. And there's a photo of ambulances lined up with their hoods open, trying to keep the vehicles cool so they don't overheat while they make multiple runs per hour, taking victims of heat stroke to the hospital. California's rolling blackouts are another example, the dangers of a grid gone down in this era of climate catastrophe, with land use decisions and population growth and the economic plight from COVID-19 making things only worse. And the same New York Times article cites a prediction that 1 in 12 Americans in the southern half of the country will move to California, the Mountain West, and Northwest by 2065. This only makes these challenges more overwhelming. However, there are solutions, and we have a fantastic group of experts today to discuss them. We'll be exploring the role of data mapping, data storage, and solar storage, and informing policy that helps us bring these solutions and protect people and our economy. I look forward to the conversation, and I thank you for joining us today. And over to you, Maggie Jackson from the Global Energy Center. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. A very special thank you to Kathy for her opening remarks. As she said, my name is Maggie Jackson, and I am the Deputy Director for Climate and Advanced Energy at the Global Energy Center. And we're very pleased to co-host this event with Kathy and her team at the Adrienne R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center on the sidelines of a very important week in New York, Climate Week. Before I get started, I would like to mention a few housekeeping notes. This event will be on the record, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today and share on social media by tagging us at AC Global Energy and Arsht Rock. That's ARSHT, capital ROCK. If you would like to participate in our conversation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the event, and we will incorporate them as appropriate. Please note, however, that only those directly engaging in the Zoom platform will be able to ask questions. As Kathy discussed, the recent heat and extreme weather across the West Coast and the Gulf Coast are taking a terrible toll on human life and our environment. And they're also stressing the systems and infrastructure that support our society. She gave us a few examples. And we know that these extreme events are not going to abate. Instead, they are going to increase in frequency and severity due to climate change. These events are making people aware of the risk of climate change like they never were before. And they're also forcing people to rethink about where they live and work as they deal with evacuations and days without power. For some, they may not have a choice to move due to family or work or financial circumstances. And for these people without more choices, how do we help them build resilience? We're going to talk today in terms of the electricity grid, how to keep people from being forced to leave their homes due to power outages. We have a lot of opportunity with the technologies coming around in the energy system, with the opportunity to decarbonize, to digitize, and to decentralize our energy system. And today we have an esteemed panel to talk about these opportunities, to talk about the role of utilities in mitigating outages, how citizens can turn to rooftop solar and battery storage, and how policies can make these options available and affordable to all, especially low-income communities and communities of color who bear a disproportionate cost of climate change. And as Kathy alluded to, we will also talk about how advanced technology, such as climate data and satellite data, are helping with disaster response and also planning for the future. Now, in turning to our virtual panel, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morgan Bazilian, a professor of public policy, director of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. We have Caroline Choi. She's the Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Edison International and Southern California Edison. Eliza Hodgkiss, a Senior Analyst and the Technical Group Manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the Energy Security and Resilience Center. Audrey Lee, a board member at Gridworks. And finally, Rich Sorkin, the co-founder and CEO of Jupiter Intelligence, excuse me. Without further ado, let us jump into the first round of questions. Morgan, I'd like to start with you. I've been following the work you've been doing closely, and I think you can help us understand the extent of the damage that's really happening in our country right now along the West Coast and the Gulf Coast. And I know you're using satellite technology to map power outages and high temperatures. Can you share with us about this technology and what impacts you're seeing?
Sure, Maggie. Thanks a lot. And thanks for saying that you're following our work. You know, it's the highest compliment for an academic to know that someone else has actually read one of your papers. I appreciate that. So I run an institute at the Colorado School of Mines called the Payne Institute for Public Policy. And as part of our group, we have a team called the Earth Observation Group. That's a team of satellite data scientists, physicists mostly, who work with satellite readings from an instrument called VEERS. It's a multi-spectrum satellite. And what we do with that is we have several products, including global gas flaring. We can look at fishing. And the product you're referring to looks at nighttime lights. So it's a sort of iconic images you see on the news sometimes of the world at night with those lights. Tends to come from our group. And what we've recently been doing is taking that satellite data and imagery and looking at power outages, both from conflict or war and from extreme weather events like Kathy just mentioned Hurricane Laura. So we've put out briefs on Hurricane Laura and the power outages. So what we see is at night as the satellites pass, we can see the extent of the power outages, and then we can equate that with issues of reliability on the grid, as well as resilience, which is the topic of today. If we think of resilience as bouncing back, then we can also look at the economic impacts of the power system outages, as well as how quickly they do bounce back. So we're also looking at forest fires through that satellite data, where we can see both the scale of the fire as well as the temperature by using different mathematical methods on the satellite data. So you feel free to check out that work. It's all online.
Thank you. Yes, and I would love to come back to this question of how exactly do we bounce back? But before we move into that, I'd like to go over to Audrey. We're happy to have you back. We know we've had you here before talking about the electricity grid. And I'd like to ask you, since you've done a lot of work in California, how would you characterize the electricity grid challenges we are seeing in California, and what needs to be done to mitigate power outages in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Really happy to be here. And I think it's a lot of what Kathy had said, and my other panelists are experts in this area as well. But I think the rolling outages, the rolling blackouts that we had in mid-August, it's, as Kathy said, it was wildfire on top of heat wave on top of COVID that caused that. And you had usually you have heat waves that are more localized, but you had heat waves across the entire western region of the US. And so you had increased demand. There was a lot of smoke. People were turning on their AC. to protect them from the smoke, so increased demand for electricity. And then there were some supply issues. There was some volatility with wind, but also some unexpected loss from fossil fuel generators as well. So I think, as we go into, more extreme weather because of climate change, we need to have better climate models. The historical trends we looked at in the past may not necessarily tell us what to expect in the future in terms of climate change. And then better models of the grid, just adding on to what Morgan said about data and models. How do we, a big part of dealing with the blackouts and the heat wave was being able to also utilize solar and batteries and demand flexibility. And so how do we model the grid better and more specificity to value and utilize those distributed energy resources that we can leverage, like solar storage and demand flexibility?
Thank you so much. Yes, we will definitely come back to the question of modeling, and thank you for bringing that up. But before we continue there, I'd like to give Caroline a chance to give some introductory remarks. And amid and in the wake of wildfires, what resilience measures could expedite restoration times and minimize outage frequency and duration? Caroline, in your perspective, what would your thoughts be?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this discussion. At Edison, we've been working on climate change for quite a number of years. And just almost a year ago, we introduced our Pathway 2045 paper, which is how to achieve the climate targets that California set for itself. And it includes an electric-led pathway that we think gets us to those goals at the least cost to our customers, with zero emission electricity, and then leveraging that across all aspects of the economy, including transportation and buildings. And so when we think about resiliency, we recognize that resiliency has to improve, because as we move forward in time, we see customers being even more reliant on electricity for their quality of life than they even are today. And we recognize today how important electricity is to quality of life. So when we think about this, what's happening, what we're experiencing today, which we certainly do believe is driven by climate change, we also see the need to think about foundational actions that are important regardless, around good forest management, around...
I think we lost Caroline for a second. Why don't we move on for a minute?
I'm sorry.
She's back. Okay, I'm sorry. We lost you for a minute.
Okay, sorry. I was just saying that we were talking about how important it is for customers to have a resiliency, particularly as we move forward, because electricity is even that much more important to the quality of life. So we're doing things like providing backup generators and battery solutions so that our customers and our communities can be prepared for potential emergencies and outages. And we think those programs and the services, they both minimize the impact of outages from events, whether those are earthquakes or for things like public safety power shutoffs, which we have implemented in the last year and a half to ensure that our equipment doesn't start one of these catastrophic wildfires. It's really important, as you mentioned earlier, to ensure that those programs and services really help our most vulnerable communities. And so we're doing things like no-cost backup battery and solar panels for income qualified customers, especially for those who rely on medical equipment for life support purposes and live in a high fire risk area. We're doing rebates on portable power stations, generators, and battery storage. And like temporary backup generation for essential services such as pharmacies, grocery stores, gas stations, particularly those in rural areas during a public safety power shutoff. So thanks.
Those are all fantastic examples, and I really want to dive into that a little bit more, especially since we have people like you and Audrey and Eliza who can really talk to how all these different parts of the energy system work together to build resilience. Before that, though, let's move over to Eliza. And I know you have extensive experience. You wrote the Resilience Roadmap last year, and you've done a lot of work during past hurricane recovery efforts. Can you help us understand how we are learning, how are utilities and local governments adopting new standards for rebuilding to avoid these same negative impacts to the electric grid? Eliza, we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Maggie. And I just want to echo what Caroline mentioned, that it's really exciting to be here. It's great to have this conversation. And I think all the panelists that you've organized here today have a lot of beneficial contributions. I think a lot of the communities that we've been working with at NREL are realizing that new standards are needed to be able to withstand the types of storms and disruptive events that are happening currently and are predicted to occur. Utilities and local governments are involved in things from working groups to resilience planning to be prepared for different types of disruptive events. But it's really important also for them to understand what their current vulnerabilities are within their systems, their buildings, or their infrastructure, and what the most likely hazards and threats are going to be, along with the impacts to those. The infrastructure in the buildings. So on-site power systems such as renewable energy, when paired with battery systems and energy efficiency, can often be powerful ways to overcome grid disruptions. And as you can imagine, those types of solutions do come with a capital cost. And so we're seeing a lot of utilities and local governments focusing those efforts in critical infrastructure. So focusing in areas where you have vulnerable populations or where there's high energy burden or energy poverty, or looking at hospitals or wastewater treatment facilities as a starting point. So prioritizing where they're making those investments. So I think a lot is happening in this space. And as Morgan mentioned, understanding the hazards and threats that are going to have the biggest impacts to those communities and utilities is a great starting point. And developing the policies and understanding which technologies are going to enhance resilience is important. And we're seeing communities and utilities advancing those efforts.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to move over to Rich. And Rich, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts now that you've had the chance to hear everyone else's opening. And again, I want to come back into the role of climate data and modeling. But before we go into great depth, I know that you've done some work over the last few months in California. And I'm curious to know how the public and the private sector are working together to use data in order to understand the scope of the problem posed by the recent natural disasters and how they are developing a rapid response.
Sure. Thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to be here today. And we've been at this as a company for going on 4 years and team members for the better part of our careers in one form or another. And events like this and many others, especially this week, are an indication of how much the perspective on these issues has evolved just in the last few years. From a data perspective, I want to talk about two particular issues. One from a technical perspective, and the second from kind of a public policy perspective. So Morgan mentioned the excellent work that they've been doing with satellite imagery and VERS. Much of the fundamental data that's used comes from the public sector in one form or another. A good example of this is our short-term fire prediction service in California, where we use the NOAA GOES satellite data as well as VERS and a couple of other sources. For flooding, a lot of the data that's used comes from local and federal efforts to map the terrain in one form or another, or USGS buoy data on water elevation. And these are critical components that require continued investment by the public sector across all these dimensions. Secondly, from a policy perspective, there's a bit of a Tower of Babel problem in the way that people talk about climate and resiliency. And there's a handful of very central topics where common assumptions and language would make it much more helpful to, or much easier to move forward. So this includes things like, as Eliza was talking about, where the biggest impacts are, the scope of the problem, but then subtle issues like what time horizons are we all focusing on? Is it next week? Is it 6 months? Is it 5 years, 30 years? What are the risk thresholds of what's acceptable impacts and what we need to invest substantial amounts of capital against? and what climate scenarios we're using. The understanding about the future state of the climate is evolving, I would say, slowly but steadily, and continuing to have a consistent view across the public and private sector on those issues makes a big difference.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure, again, we'll get back to some of these modeling questions. But first, to go back to some of the questions on distributed energy and its role, Caroline, you started to get into this a little bit, but can you go in a little bit more depth into how distributed energy and residential and community solar programs what the role they play as in enhancing grid resilience for your customers?
Yeah, thanks. We're doing some really exciting pilots. One, and I'm sure Audrey can speak to even more, but we are partnering with Sunrun on a virtual power plant pilot. And so to do that, the pilot entails enrolling nearly 300 residential customers, all of whom have existing PV and paired battery systems installed. Sunrun installed both its Brightbox and the Tesla Powerwall systems, and then we offered customers a $250 incentive for enrolling in the program. It's similar to our time of use pilot that we did with Nest around smart thermostats, where we successfully demonstrated that you could have both an energy cost reduction and an energy shift. And those are the types of projects that we see as real opportunities, particularly in a situation like we just had, not just in mid-August, but also over Labor Day weekend when we had high heat, we had wildfires. We actually had more capacity out than was out in mid-August. And it was the ability of customers to shift their load, to use different resources. And currently, that's a lot of backup generation that's diesel powered, but we see the future being the backup systems that are clean energy and batteries that would allow the system to, and it worked this time too over Labor Day weekend, allow us to avoid those rolling outages. So we see customers being really critical, both residential as well as the small and medium businesses and large businesses, to ensuring the resiliency and reliability of the system going forward. So really excited about programs like the virtual power plant and the program that we did with Nest as just examples of what could be done.
No, those are fantastic examples. And I'd like to probably follow up and ask Audrey to comment on that. And I'm really interested in the role of the consumer and how you see them getting involved and what incentive mechanisms there are. Is it something that's being driven from a utility like SoCal Edison, or are these consumers coming to you saying, I want to put these panels? I'm sure there's a little bit of both. Audrey, would you start if you have any thoughts on that? And then Caroline, if you'd like to chime in again, please do so.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a really important question because on top of wildfires and heat waves and blackouts, we also really have to decarbonize to address climate change. And so, as Caroline said, it really speaks to the role that distributed energy resources and customers, what customers can do in terms of decarbonizing. And what I mean by electrification on the customer side is, transitioning away from natural gas. And if we're greening our whole electricity system, we want to move people more to electricity, which is greenhouse. As our electricity gets cleaner, we want people to use that clean electricity as opposed to natural gas, which still does emit greenhouse gases. I also volunteer as a co-chair on the Clean Energy for Biden group, which is separate from not affiliated with the campaign, but organizes the clean energy community to support Biden and Harris. He has a platform, a policy goal to be 100% clean electricity by 2035. And so that's a really important policy to help us decarbonize and electrify. And so for what that means to the individual customer is, first energy efficiency, trying to reduce the electricity that they're using, but putting on rooftop solar and batteries, as Eliza said. And there are various ways that customers can do that through companies like Sunrun and other providers as well, to get rooftop solar and then batteries. And the batteries can be used to help manage the electrical grid, especially when they're collaborating with a utility like Southern California Edison. But then that battery can also be used for backup. And there's various different, the industry is so mature now that there's various financial options, whether a customer wants to lease it or do a power purchase agreement or buy it outright or get a loan. And then there are additionally policy incentives out there, like in California, the self-generation incentive program. But also for multifamily low-income housing in California, there's an important policy called SOMA that helps put rooftop solar on multifamily low-income housing. And I think a really important piece of that is how do you organize individuals to benefit by having backup, but then how do you organize communities as a whole to back up so that, if your neighbor doesn't have solar and batteries, that you can share that electricity. And I think that is done mainly through collaborating with the utility. How do we reimagine our grids that whole communities can have resilience as opposed to just individual customers, which is a great step forward, but I think we need to do more. And another piece of it is equity, I think, ensuring access. And I think, this has been touched on by the other panelists, but how do we ensure that low-income customers and customers that are in disadvantaged communities get access? And I think that's an important role for policy to play as well.
Yeah,
Yes,
and I'll just add on, Maggie, just super quick that, when we're testing, when we do these pilots, is to test in our different scenarios, is to test to see how the customers perform, how the systems perform, not just day ahead and day of, but also looking at different weather conditions, testing for responsiveness and delivering energy, whether we're able to deliver the energy that's expected, and then testing our overall operational effectiveness in the process and our protocols and whether or not those work effectively, because it's no longer the utility doing it. Right now it's working with others like Sunrun and working with our customers, and so it's making sure that the operational processes are ones that make the most sense and are able to be both reactive and active as the situation calls for.
Thank you so much. And Eliza, I'd like to bring you in on this conversation because one of the things we talked about in these prep calls was this question of, if a customer installs solar panels, are they in fact resilient? Are they able to island themselves? And if they aren't, what needs to happen to allow them to do so?
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding, that if you have solar panels on your roof that you're going to be fine during a disaster or some sort of grid disruption. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call know that what we've seen during and after disruptive events is that just because you have those panels in place doesn't mean that you're necessarily resilient. So I like to break it up into two different categories, one being a technological category and the other being policies or agreements. And ideally, an end user would have solar panels installed along with some type of energy storage system. We typically see battery storage systems paired with solar panels, but then you also need islanding controls. During Hurricane Sandy recovery efforts, a few vulnerabilities in New Jersey's systems were exposed. There were a lot of rooftop solar installations, but they weren't able to operate during or after the storm. And so one of the things that was missing besides islanding controls and battery storage systems was having an interconnection agreement or a net metering agreement that allowed people to island from the grid. So it's really important to make sure that you have all of those pieces, and without the right technical solutions and agreements, it won't be possible to operate those systems in islanded mode.
Thank you very much for that explanation. I know that's been a question on my mind. Morgan, I'd like to turn to you and ask if you have any thoughts on that topic. And I know you've done some analysis in the past too on the financing challenges of installing distributed energy resources. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, just that I'd like to build on what Audrey and Eliza and Caroline just said, in as much as they alluded to it. But if we think of power systems and their resilience, it's far beyond a technical challenge, right? There are complex technical interactions, but there are also fundamental physics layered by electrical engineering, layered by finance, economics, policy regulation, and then politics, whether or not we like it. And so trying to integrate that vastly disparate group of not only areas of expertise, which no one is expert in all of those areas, to answering a complex systems question like resilience or climate change becomes increasingly difficult. And I think Eliza touched on some of that, answering your specific question about islanding. So we think that Yeah, so the work you're alluding to is years ago, and up to more recently, when I was at the World Bank, we looked at how to plan and finance power systems in fragile and conflict states. So we were focusing on places like South Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan at that time. And we did a series of modeling exercises going from sort of basic modeling to sort of, relatively fancy math. But what they all came up with was that the only feasible way to construct these systems was going to be incrementally and likely through technologies like mini grids or small grid systems. And you can see today that um, while I still believe that makes most sense in those fragile and conflict states, the U.S. military also has taken that line, and NREL does a lot of work on this as well, where you're going to, for issues of resilience, both from, say, attack and theater, but also from hurricanes and other extreme weather events, and bases in the United States are moving towards those kind of systems. So hope that's useful for you.
No, that's definitely useful. And Rich, I'd like to give you a chance to chime in, because as you opened with, the climate data that your organization is offering is really going to help shape these investment decisions that utilities are looking at and that local governments are looking at. Can you help us understand the role that plays and how that might mitigate some of these challenges moving forward?
Sure. Really appreciate the question. This is an area we've got tremendous amount of experience with. And, fortunately, some of our power sector customers allow us to talk about our work with them. In some cases, it's confidential. So just for context, we've done heat stress work with Con Ed, flood and wind stress, both short-term and climate time horizons with Hawaiian Electric that provides all the power for the state of Hawaii, including all the military installations there. In Europe, Turno is one of the largest distributors of energy in Europe. And then in the US, top 10 power company with pretty significant production assets that were impacted in Louisiana during Hurricane Laura, where we were literally in the war room providing input on what to expect in terms of storm surge as the hurricane approached. So lot of perspective on this. We recently published a case study with Hawaiian Electric that provides kind of two levels of framework in thinking about these issues. And essentially, it's about decision making under uncertainty, which is something that corporations throughout the world have a lot of experience with, but less so in a disciplined way in this area. And some of the things that that addressed were identifying the climate vulnerable assets, developing a targeted risk-based resiliency plan, hardening infrastructure, and then a whole set of customer regulatory and disclosure related issues. And what they're using the analytics for are for prioritizing the transmission and distribution system hardening, optimizing the placement of new generation sites, prioritizing the use of flood warning systems, and estimating the potential damage to renewable systems from severe weather events impacted by climate change that would then essentially have a knock-on effect to the benefits of a distributed grid. So it's a bit of circularity there to it as well. And all that's been extensively published. Happy to share it in more detail. One final thought on this is that from a public policy perspective, I think the single most effective thing that we've seen done to date is incorporating capital investments in resiliency in the rate of return calculations that then translate into pricing. There's a bit of a double-edged sword because consumers and, as Morgan mentioned before, voters don't want to pay higher prices, but the money's got to come from someplace, and that is essentially the vehicle for fostering these kinds of investments in resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to go to Eliza because I know that NREL has a number of resilience pilot projects happening. Could you talk to those and how they might be incorporating some of the things we've already talked about in this panel in terms of the challenges and the opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. We do have a lot of current projects that range from modeling to hardware in the loop testing. If you look back in time, about 8 years ago, we had one project related to resilience, and now we have over 50. So I think that's just a sign of the times that this is a really important area of research. So a lot of the projects that we have are looking at metrics for resilience, and if there is one set of metrics that can be used across the grid system, how to value and monetize resilience, looking at policies that support and enhance resilience, durability of materials and whether the installation and maintenance of renewable energy technologies is impacted, and the resilience of those is impacted. So I think we've been talking a lot about solar, but we do look at a number of different technologies in the research that we do here at the lab. So trying to outline what different attributes of resilience are, if it's robustness or reliability or redundancy, and how different types of renewable energy technologies can enhance resilience through those attributes. So we really do have a diverse portfolio of research that's going on, as well as some on the ground deployment of technologies, and some of our hardware in the loop testing that is going on between our main campus and our Flatirons campus is really innovative and testing a lot of those different theories and systems. But we also have agreements in place to work with utilities or communities to really research some of the issues that are nearest and dearest to their hearts, but also testing some of those technologies to see where the points of failure are and what can be improved to enhance resilience. So maybe not a satisfactory answer, Maggie. There's not one or two projects that we're working on. There's a big portfolio that's very diverse.
Thank you so much. No, that was a great overview. And we're getting a lot of audience questions. I will encourage the audience to continue to reach out and answer, or sorry, present your questions in the chat. We'll work to answer them. One has come up is about how do you make, or the role of virtual power plants and how you make those accessible. Can you speak a little bit more to virtual power plants and the role that they play, Audrey?
Yes, happy to. I was busy typing my answers to some of those questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important that lower income communities and disadvantaged communities have access to solar batteries as well, so that they have that resiliency, as well as can participate in some of the utility programs that Caroline mentioned. And I think while I was at Sunrun, we put out a paper about the situation in Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, where they're trying to close 3 of their power plants there, and showed that the incentives that you can offer to make solar batteries more accessible to customers, even after those incentives, they are still more competitive than fossil fuel power plants in contrast. So I think we need to compare apples to apples in terms of, do we continue to invest in fossil fuel peakers and power plants versus investing in our customers and helping them put rooftop solar where they can get the resiliency benefit, as well as the benefit to and the decarbonization. We can all get the decarbonization benefit, as well as the grid benefit, especially if you aggregate those into virtual power plants and coordinate with the utility, so the utility can manage those and operate the grid in the best way that in order to avoid those outages.
Thank you so much. And Caroline, can you add on to that, please, from your perspective at SoCal Edison?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we have a diverse audience here. And so I know sometimes California is seen as a little bit off the charts in terms of what we're willing to do. I do think California often leads the way, and it's not that all states adopt exactly what California has done, but we are willing to experiment and try new ideas. And I do think looking to our customers as part of the solution is one of those. It is different than a utility, which is used to doing the planning and doing the generation and transmission and distribution all by itself. So it's certainly a new way of doing things. So top of the virtual power plants, I think we recognize that resilience also comes with investing in the system itself. And so we certainly are looking at large scale renewables as well, and adding more renewables, utility size renewables into the system, as well as investing in the electric system to make it more resilient as well. So hardening infrastructure, bolstering situational awareness capabilities. And we've done a lot of that, particularly around wildfire, enhancing operational practices. And you see a lot of that happening, not just at Edison, but across the country in terms of digital assets and machine learning and things like that, that we can really leverage these new tools to give us additional data, to give us better data analytics, and then that technology, leveraging that technology for better planning and, again, more resilient. So and while we talked a lot about solar and storage, it's also microgrids that might be serving more than just one home, or maybe it's a neighborhood. And so we are looking also at resilience microgrids in our territory this year, and also looking for proposals to install microgrids in areas around high fire risk areas that are subject to public safety power shutoffs over the next several years, particularly on those circuits that are in wildfire areas. So it is, just as it has always been, it's a diversity of resources that will ensure a resilient system. And it's, yes, leveraging customers and looking at programs and services that they can provide, that the commission and the utilities commissions in all these states will be significant partners in being able to do that. But it's allowing for investments by the utilities to harden their infrastructure and do things that are going to be essential as we think about the next decade and beyond.
Thank you so much. One of the questions that came up in terms of hardening was about physical barrier protection, seawalls, barrier islands, burying lines, or raising power plants. What is the role for these measures moving forward? And please, anyone, feel free to chime in. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, Caroline, or anyone else.
I can certainly start off, but I am sure others have a point of view. All those are worth exploring. Obviously, seawalls and sea barriers, when we think about sea level rise, they have implications because they are moving. You're taking something that's natural, and yes, it's changing, but that's what nature does. And you're affecting that by adding seawalls or sea barriers. And so there are implications definitely to doing those types of things. Instead of, or maybe in lieu of, moving infrastructure, changing, hardening infrastructure like the utility system, or we might have to move power lines or move substations that are in low-lying areas and that sort of thing. And so there's a cost, absolutely, but certainly it's not just about the benefit of the infrastructure that's added, but what are the downstream implications of that? And we have the Coastal Commission that looks at those things and has taken comment on that, because these coastal communities currently have the requirement to build climate plans that take into consideration the fact that we are seeing sea level rise and expect more of that.
Thank you so much. We have another question that goes back to modeling, and this question from Joshua Putterman is, what level of multi-scale extreme weather event formation modeling is the panel involved in, if at all? I don't know if Rich or Morgan or Eliza, you have comments on that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So at Jupiter, we're modeling the impact of current and future weather into various different impacts. So that includes things like flooding and wind damage and fire, which of course is impacted by weather, but is not solely a weather phenomenon. And in all of these cases, we're including all of the factors in a compound factor approach to get the best possible predictions, and also understand the complexity of the various different factors and what that implies in terms of uncertainty around the predictions. In many cases, the uncertainty is no greater, even in 30-year time horizons, than the typical decisions that corporations make under uncertainty. And the tendency to talk about complexity or uncertainty is often a vehicle for not addressing issues, as opposed to a real reason not to do it. And I would say, quite frankly, that the modeling and the analytics and the data is much further ahead than the decision making and the capital investment using that data. And so there's an opportunity for things to progress quite rapidly in the next few years if the will is there to do it.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Maggie, I'll build on what Rich said. I completely agree, especially with that last sentence. The numerical methods for understanding uncertainty in energy have become far more sophisticated over the last decade or two, but they are limited mostly to academic journal papers, which hardly anyone ever reads. But I'd like to come to that point about what can be implemented and what Caroline was discussing. Your question about various pieces of adaptation, or how do we adapt to this changing climate? Yes, there are technical solutions, again, big storm walls, etc. But there are also more subtle and kind of more boring answers that have to do with how we do forest management, how we do urban planning, how we do land use planning, and how we connect those to policy that are likely to make a lot more difference than the concrete technical solutions by themselves.
And Maggie, I would just build on that similar to what Rich and Morgan just mentioned, we're also doing modeling across multiple scales and across different types of sectors. And what I think is important is that you really do need to have robust data to inform your decisions. But we take a qualitative and a quantitative approach to the work that we're doing in this space, because a lot of times the data only tells you so much, and it's not until you start to talk to people about what their operational or institutional vulnerabilities might be that you can start to tease out some of those gaps. So kind of related to what Morgan was just mentioning, that it goes just beyond the technical solutions, and it's multifaceted, and it's really important to not just model something, but also have a qualitative and quantitative approach to it.
That's an excellent point, and thank you just for jumping in there to everyone. I'd like to turn this back to Caroline and Audrey. We have a question that says, of all the decisions that utilities make in regard to grid resilience, which are the hardest ones due to the lack of integrated modeling of climate and electricity and operations? So I guess this is a good question to ask with all these people that are modeling experts. That what are we still missing, or what kind of information are you still looking for to make your decisions?
I would say that one of the things we don't have yet in California is integrated modeling across the entities that are responsible for addressing climate. So we have the Air Resources Board, we have the Energy Commission, we have the Independent System Operator who manages the transmission system, and of course we have the Public Utilities Commission. And while the Integrated Electric Planning program, IPER, that the CEC runs is intended to be the baseline for what other agencies use, we have suggested that it's not aggressive enough given the targets that we have for 2030 and how much action needs to take place between now and 2030. And we certainly feel a sense of urgency that get updated so that we can make decisions that are, we think, more in line with what is necessary to be done. I'll just give you an example. The state has a 5 million zero emission vehicle goal. We think by 2030, we think that really needs to be upwards of 7.5 million or more, particularly as we think about 2045 and a more aggressive goal even for the state to be carbon neutral. And so the goals are one thing, but the way that the state integrates that planning, and then the way that the utilities and other entities that are part of that whole electric ecosystem work together to advance that thinking. Because I do think in California, we are certainly very aligned with hitting the 2030 target, hitting 2045 target, and seeing an electric-led pathway, not an electric-only pathway, but an electric-led pathway as being really critical to that. So that integrated planning and using the models and updated modeling and updated planning tools, which haven't, I don't think, kept up with where we are today. I think we really need to update those and continuously update them as we see additional data and as the tools become more sophisticated. And they have evolved much more rapidly than I think the regulatory entities have maintained.
Yeah, I agree with what Caroline is saying. I think the reason why I joined to be a board member on Gridworks is because I think we have a regulatory process. It can be contentious. It only looks out a certain period ahead in terms of a general rate case and grid modernization, but these problems are very big. And so we need to look out even further ahead. And so Gridworks helps facilitate these kinds of conversations where we don't want to be in a contentious kind of meeting, but we want to work together, right? You want the environmentalists, the ratepayer advocates, the utilities to think about longer term planning. And I think it is about, more transparency in these models, not having black box models. I think when the grid was much more centralized, it made sense for the utility to be the expert on the grid and to recommend what they should invest in. But now that you have more distributed energy resources, customers participating in the grid, I think we need to make that process more transparent. We need to improve those models, as Caroline said, integrate them, but also make them more transparent so that all stakeholders can participate more together in this. Based on my experience at the Public Utilities Commission, there's just, and I worked on some data proceedings. There's more that could be done if we all put our data together and our models together and look at these longer term impacts.
Thank you so much. Yes, there was actually a question about how do we make this data more widely available, so we can think on that too. But I want to follow up quickly from a question from our director, Randy Bell, and his question is, doesn't the situation in California suggest that California needs zero carbon dispatchable power? And until these issues are addressed, should Diablo Canyon be shut down? So Caroline, I'm sure you have thoughts on this too. Audrey, if you do, or anyone else, please feel free to speak to it.
We want all zero carbon resources, and Diablo Canyon certainly is a critical one. I think to have it extended, as a federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission process, I don't know that it can be done in the time frame between now and when it's currently scheduled to retire. But no disagreement that California, and not just California, but all the states and the world needs more zero emission resources, and we need to be moving in that direction as quickly as possible. I do think it's a really great opportunity to make sure that there are people who certainly we've seen in the last month talk about California and use the situation that we had in mid-August and even the situation we had over Labor Day weekend, where we were in a very tight situation. We think as a red herring to say that we should slow our momentum towards that clean energy future. We would disagree with that and say instead we need to double down on moving towards that clean energy future faster and ensuring that we're making the investments necessary to ensure a reliable system. And so that is more energy storage and the ability to have ramping resources, but not to slow the progress and the momentum towards more zero emission resources. We think that's really critical, and we need to be advancing that as rapidly as possible, and not just in California.
Yeah, and I want to bring in the issue of cost. I mean, obviously, about cost, and not every state is like California. But I think, going back to the modeling issue, we need to model the economics. And I think that because our markets may not have caught up with the technology that we have, we may not be valuing those flexible, dispatchable resources that are carbon-free as we should. And if we valued them appropriately and compared them apples to apples with fossil fuel generation, you could see that they are economic and that we can meet our needs. And so, if you take electrification as an example, putting in electric vehicle charging in our homes and electrifying transportation, or electrifying heating of water and space, heating and cooling, we need to add in the benefits, not just of, better health by reducing natural gas emissions in the home, and there can be, if you price electricity based on supply and demand and time of use pricing, and you're able to shift your loads with those electrical devices, and as well as if you can use those devices to meet the grid flexibility that we need and compensate customers for that, those can really help defray the costs of this new technology and give our customers better outcomes. But it requires policy market changes. It requires better modeling to understand those economic benefits of these new technologies.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate those tangible examples of what this is going to mean for customers in the future and as they're continue to be more involved. Rich, I'd like to turn back to you and then maybe give Morgan and Eliza also to comment on this. But to move this back towards an adaptation conversation, some of your modeling shows the impact that sea level rise and these temperature changes are going to have on communities and where people may have no choice but to move. So what are the trends you're seeing there, and how do we think about that in terms of how we're planning for building out our grid and building out distributed resources and even utility scale?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So, the first thing that I would say is that there's a range of optimum responses to stresses in different places, and there's not kind of one size fits all. And in the vast majority of cases, we are dealing with stakeholders, public and private sector, who aren't even evaluating the differences in the different options. It's more of a theoretical conversation about managed retreat or seawalls at two ends of the spectrum. And every single one of these options in every single place, the data and the analytics are good enough to make an ROI-based decision around what's the optimum thing to do. Now, there's still, even if it's purely ROI-based, there are huge socioeconomic implications, especially for underserved and underrepresented communities that need to show up through the political process in some way. But there's no question in some places assets are going to have accelerated retirement and be relocated. In other places, assets can be hardened, or there can be small scale operational changes. And then, quite frankly, in a lot of places, doing nothing, at least right now, is the right solution relative to places that are or assets or communities that are much more heavily impacted. And so, kind of taking a portfolio approach to everything in the country or in the world and only focusing, at least from an adaptation perspective, on the biggest impacts now will make a huge difference. And the last thing I'd say on this topic, I'll be real quick, sorry, is, some extent, this is going to be a Darwinian competition among regions, both within nation states and across nation states, that the places that do a good job in thinking these issues through will be attractive to capital and knowledge workers. And the places that don't, ultimately, in some cases sooner than others, will see capital and knowledge worker flight.
Thank you so much. Eliza, in the work that you're doing around the country, do you have any of the same findings?
Yeah, we do have very similar findings to what Rich just outlined. And I think if people are looking for good case studies, looking at communities that have been impacted by either natural disasters or long-term stressors, as Rich mentioned, can prove to be very useful. I know that a lot of Alaskan communities are faced with things like coastal erosion and permafrost melting. And so they're needing to relocate entire communities. So you can learn a lot by what they're experiencing and how they're choosing to relocate and rebuild. But also the military has some really great examples of what is working well and what hasn't worked historically. So looking across the board at where you can find some of those good examples and what lessons can be learned from those might be useful.
And Morgan, I had offered you the opportunity to comment. Did you have any last thoughts on that last question about what?
Just that I think it really matters how you draw your system boundary for what you're going to look at. So as Rich said, if you draw your system boundary around everything, you're not going to come up with very compelling answers because it's just too hard to do it. About 12 years ago, I wrote a textbook on optimization and portfolio theory and decision making in finance, and it really lends itself to these questions of resilience. And just to end, I think Eliza got it spot on there that we have to look at the impacts on local communities and how they can use their own resources and intelligence and abilities to change the situation is the best place to start.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a perfect closing. And again, that's looking out longer term. But again, I think we've really underlined the point here about the value of climate data. And I just want to thank all of you for being with us this afternoon and sharing your expertise in this area. I know we've all learned a lot. I think this is a very timely and productive conversation. I'd like to also thank Roger Morales, Zach Strauss, Emma Smith, the whole audiovisual team, and also the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center for their work in organizing today's event. If you'd like to rewatch today's event or share the stream with a colleague, you can find a cached replay on the Atlantic Council website or our YouTube channel. And for more global energy content, please join us on Thursday, September 24th at 9 a.m. Eastern for our next episode of the Energy Innovation Stream series, which will feature Benny Oyen, the executive head of market development in the Platinum Group Metals team at Anglo American, who will discuss Anglo American's comprehensive approach to supporting the development of a global hydrogen economy. Again, I kept you a few minutes late. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you virtually next time.